How do we know the gods chose them? A boy asked. The small classroom became quiet. The teacher had been telling the old story of Aram, the story every child learned. Lena was walking past the open doorway with 2 water jars when she heard the question. She slowed without meaning to. The boy was still looking at the teacher, waiting for an answer. The teacher placed one hand beside a clay tablet. "Because it is written," he said. No one asked another question. Lena looked at the tablet from the doorway. She had heard those words many times before. The high houses ruled because it was written. Workers served because it was written. The answer was so familiar that most people no longer noticed it. Aram was a city beside a great river. Mud brick walls protected it. A temple stood near the center, and the largest homes belonged to the high houses. People also knew where they belonged. Scribes kept records. Farmers grew grain. Builders repaired walls. Potters made jars and bowls. Workers dug canals and carried stone. The city called this order. Almost no one asked who had created it. Lena walked through the market toward home. She was 19 and had spent most of her life helping her mother make pottery. She knew the streets, the smells of grain and clay, and the sound of merchants calling to customers. But that afternoon, the teacher's answer stayed with her. Because it is written. Lena wondered why those 4 words felt different today. At home, Darren was fighting with a clay jar. "It is leaning again," Lena said. "It has character," her younger brother replied. Nini looked up from a bowl she was shaping. "It has too much character. Make another one." Darren laughed, and Lena laughed with him. For a few minutes, their small workshop felt safe, ordinary, and warm. Then 3 hard knocks struck the wooden door. The laughter stopped. Lena opened it. A city official stood outside with 2 guards. He held a clay order tablet in one hand. "Which family is this?" he asked. "Nemi's household," Lena's mother answered. The official looked past her and into the workshop. "We need 1 worker for the new reservoir." Nemi stepped forward. "We already paid the grain tax," she said, "and the market fee." "This is not a tax," the official replied. "This is service." His eyes moved past her and stopped on Darren. "He will go." Nemi immediately stood between them. "He is 17. He is old enough." Darren's smile had disappeared. Lena stared at the official, but he did not look at her. The official raised the order tablet and read from it. "Every family must serve according to the place given to them by the gods." Nemi's face tightened. "What happens if we refuse?" "A fine first," he said. "Then property may be taken." Lina looked at the marks pressed into the clay. A few lines on a tablet were enough to take her brother away. Darren packed a small cloth bag before sunset. At the city gate, he tried to smile. "I will be back before you miss me." "I already miss you," Lena said. "That is your problem." She almost laughed. Then the other workers began to move. Darren touched her shoulder with his free hand. "Look after Mother. You look after yourself." He nodded and joined the group. Lena stayed at the gate long after Darren had started down the road. The temple stood behind her. The road to the reservoir stretched ahead. She thought about the classroom, because it is written. But clay did not write itself. Someone had pressed every sign into every tablet. For the first time, Lena asked a different question. Who had written the story that decided their lives? Days passed with no message from Darren. Nimi began looking toward the street every few minutes. At meals, she still left a little food aside for him. "He will be hungry when he comes back," she said. Lena did not tell her that the food was becoming dry. Instead, she worked longer hours at the pottery wheel and tried not to imagine what was happening outside the city. On the 4th afternoon, Lena carried pottery through the central market. Everything looked normal. Merchants argued over grain prices. Children ran between stalls. A man complained about a broken jar. Then the ground moved. At first, Lina thought she had lost her balance. A moment later, bowls shook on the tables around her. The shaking grew stronger. A clay jar fell and broke beside Lena. People shouted. A mother grabbed her child. A merchant tried to hold down his table. Dust fell from the walls. Lena placed one jar on the ground and held the other tightly. Then a deep sound came from the direction of the temple. It was the sound of old bricks giving way. Part of the temple wall collapsed into the courtyard. A cloud of dust rolled across the ground. People stepped back, covering their mouths. When the shaking finally stopped, workers moved toward the damaged section. Lena followed at a distance. No one seemed badly hurt. But behind the broken bricks, something strange had appeared. There was a narrow room inside the wall. One worker looked around the opening. Where is the door? There was no door. The chamber had been sealed behind another wall. Broken shelves leaned inside. Pieces of clay covered the floor. A temple official had not arrived yet, so several workers began clearing loose bricks. Lena moved closer. She stepped into the hidden room. Dust floated in a line of sunlight behind her. Most of the tablets were broken. Some had been crushed beneath fallen wood. Lena could read only simple signs, but she had learned enough as a child to recognize common words. She moved carefully through the debris. Then she saw one tablet that looked different from the rest. It was darker and older. 2 fallen bricks covered part of it. Lena pulled them aside and lifted the tablet with both hands. The surface was filled with small wedge-shaped marks. She recognized one word, Aram. Then another phrase she remembered from lessons with an old scribe named Saren. The first days. Her heart began to beat faster. Everyone out. A temple official had reached the broken wall. This area is closed. Workers began leaving the room. Lena looked at the old tablet again. She did not know why, but she was suddenly afraid someone would take it before she understood it. She slipped it into her cloth bag beneath her shawl and walked out with the others. That night, after Nemi went to sleep, Lena placed the tablet under an oil lamp. She studied the marks slowly. Some words were familiar. Others were too old or too difficult. She could see the name Aram several times. She could also see words for family, river, and beginning. But the sentences did not match the story Lena had learned. By morning, she knew who she needed to ask. Saran had taught Lena a little reading when she was younger. He was old now, and he worked in a small room beside the temple archive. When Lena placed the tablet on his table, his reed stylus stopped in the air. For several seconds, he did not move. Then he looked at Lena. "Where did you get this?" "You know what it is," she said. Saran's face became pale. He closed the wooden door. "Give it to me." Lena pulled the tablet closer. "Why? It belongs to the temple." "That is not an answer." "Lena, Saran, you looked afraid before you even read it." His hand remained over the table. Finally, he lowered it. "Take it home," he said. "Hide it, show no one." Now Lena was certain. He knew exactly what she had found. Lena moved toward the door, then stopped. "Who built the wall around that room?" Saran did not answer. She turned back. Was it sealed by accident? His eyes dropped toward the floor. That was enough. The fear on his face had changed into something else. Guilt. Lena left with the tablet hidden beneath her shawl. Behind her, Saran did not try to stop her. The next morning, shouting came from the city gate. Lena ran toward it. A wooden cart was entering the city with injured workers. Others walked beside it, covered in dust. Then Lena saw Darren. His tunic was dirty. His right shoulder was wrapped in cloth. "Darren." He looked up. "I am all right," he said. But the way he was standing told her he was not. Lena pushed through the crowd and reached him. For 1 second she wanted to hit him for smiling. Then she wanted to hold him. What happened? A wall fell. Where? At the reservoir. Nemi arrived behind Lena and touched Darren's face. "Home," she said. "We talk at home." Darren did not argue. Nemi cleaned his shoulder in the workshop. Darren tried not to show pain. Lena held a bowl of water while her mother wrapped fresh cloth around his right shoulder and upper arm. Was it an accident? Lena asked. Darren looked at her. Yes, he said. Then he looked away. Lena knew her brother well enough to hear the missing part of the answer. Later, when Nemi went to prepare food, Lena sat beside him. What are you not telling us? Darren was quiet. We saw cracks in the wall 2 days ago. Lena stared at him. You told someone? Many times. And? They said we had to finish before the inspection. Darren swallowed. 3 men were under the wall when it fell. Barrick did not come out alive. That afternoon, Lena and Nemi carried food to Barrick's home. His wife sat outside with 2 children. There were no loud cries. The silence was worse. Barrick's youngest child kept asking when his father would come home. His mother did not answer. Lena placed the food beside them. She had never spoken much with Barrick. Now she wished she had. A city official arrived while they were there. He placed 1 small bag of grain on the ground. This is support from the city, he said. Barrick's widow stared at the bag. The official continued, Your husband fulfilled the duty given to his family by the gods. The widow looked up. Can my children eat a report? The official had no answer. Lena felt something inside her change. Back home, Lena went to the rear wall of the workshop. She lifted the loose floor stone beside the pottery shelves and took out the hidden tablet. Nemi watched from across the room. Where are you going? To ask a question. You have already asked questions, not the right one. Lena wrapped the tablet in cloth. This time, she did not feel curious. She felt angry. Saran opened the door and saw the tablet in Lena's hands. Read it, she said. No, my brother could have died. Saran closed his eyes. Lena, this will not give you the simple answer you want. I did not ask for a simple answer. Saran studied her for a long moment. Then he locked the door, closed the window, and lit a second lamp. Everyone says that before they hear the truth. Saran placed the tablet between them. He traced the old signs with 1 finger. This record was written before the story you learned in school. Lena leaned closer. How long before? Long enough that most people forgot it ever existed. He began to read. At first, the words sounded like a simple account of families traveling after a flood. Then, Lena understood why the tablet had been hidden. The record said that after a great flood, 7 families reached high ground beside the river. They were tired. They had little food. Some had lost homes and relatives. None arrived as a king. None arrived as a servant. They were simply survivors. They stayed because the ground was dry enough to build on and the river was close enough to keep them alive. 1 family knew grain. Another knew building. 1 made pottery. 1 knew trade and distant resources. 1 cared for the sick. 1 kept records. 1 understood rivers and canals. The families needed one another. They dug together, built together, shared food and water. Over time, the small settlement became Aram. The tablet did not describe 1 family above the others. It described people surviving because they worked together. Lena stared at Saran. Which family did the gods choose to rule? Saran did not answer immediately. None. She thought she had heard him incorrectly. Which family was chosen? None, Lena. And which family was born to serve? None. The room seemed smaller. Everything Lena had learned about Aram suddenly stood beside a different story. But the temple tablets say, I know what they say. Lena looked down at the old record. Because it is written. The teacher's words returned to her. Now, there were 2 written stories. One said the gods had created fixed places for every family. The other said ordinary families had built the city together. For the first time, Lena understood that writing could preserve truth. It could also preserve something else. Saran walked to a wooden chest in the corner. He opened it. Inside were cracked tablets, blackened edges, and records damaged by fire. What are these? The years before the new story. Lena picked up 1 tablet. It listed destroyed grain stores. Another named streets that had been closed. another recorded families that had disappeared. This was inside Aram? She asked. Saren nodded. Aram almost destroyed itself. Lena put the damaged tablet down. Who changed the story? Saren looked toward the lamp. Saren. He still said nothing. Who decided the gods had chosen the high houses? His shoulders lowered. Who wrote that workers were born to serve? At last, he looked directly at her. We did. Lena stopped breathing for a moment. The man who had once taught her to read had helped write the lie. We did, Saren repeated. Then he told her why. He had been 22 when the river fell lower than anyone remembered. Fields dried. Families argued over water. One group closed part of a canal. Another group opened it during the night. At first, people shouted. Then they broke gates. Then they began choosing sides. Saran had watched a disagreement about water become something much larger. A grain store burned. Families blamed one another. Guards stopped protecting the whole city and started protecting districts. Streets were blocked. Merchants stopped coming. Food became harder to find. People who had lived beside one another for years began asking which family a person belonged to before deciding whether to help them. Aram did not fall to an outside enemy. It began to break from inside. Saran was a young scribe then. I told myself I was only writing, he said. First he copied orders about grain, then orders about gates, then orders about guards. Later came searches and arrests. Each tablet looked small in his hands. But when a guard carried it into the street, the words became action. Saran said he had learned too late that a person could do great harm while claiming he was only following a job. His father died while carrying food across a district line. After that, Saran wanted revenge. His older brother joined the guards. He said our family had to answer blood with blood. Months later, his brother died too. Saran sat alone in the same house where he had grown up. For a time, he said, I wanted every family I blamed to suffer. Lena looked at him differently then. She did not forgive him, but she understood the fear behind his choices. The fighting continued for years. No family was strong enough to rule the whole city, but each was strong enough to stop another family from ruling. Finally, exhausted leaders met with senior scribes inside the temple. They argued through the night. Canals were broken. Grain was low. Guards obeyed different leaders. The old agreements no longer worked. Then someone asked a dangerous question. What if authority did not come from any living family at all? What if people believed the decision had already been made by the gods? A ruler chosen by heaven could stand above the rival families. Fixed duties could stop people fighting over who had the right to command. Senior scribes began writing a new origin story. Saren was one of them. We wrote that the gods gave every family its place, he said. We told ourselves that a shared story might create a shared city again. The new story was copied. It was read at ceremonies. Children learned it in classrooms. Officials used its words in laws and labor orders. Years passed. The fighting slowly ended. Canals were repaired. Grain returned to the markets. Children again walked through streets without guards fighting at every corner. The lie worked, Lena said quietly. Saran looked at her. Yes, that answer hurt more than she expected. The older records became dangerous. Some were destroyed. Others were hidden. Saren helped place several tablets inside a narrow storage room. He remembered putting the dark tablet on a shelf himself. Then workers built a new wall across the entrance. I thought we were burying the cause of another war, he said, but we were also burying the truth. Decades later, the earthquake had opened what Saran had helped close. Lena stood across from him. You protected a lie. Yes. You let people believe they were born below other people. Yes. Saren did not defend himself. At first, the story gave one city one command. It stopped some of the fighting. And then peace became habit. Habit became power. High houses gained more land. Scribes controlled more knowledge. Officials used duty whenever they needed labor. Lena looked at him with anger and sadness. Then I will take this to the market. Saran looked at the tablet. And what happens tomorrow? People know the truth. Who controls the grain stores tomorrow morning? Who commands the guards? Who decides where the water goes? Lina opened her mouth, then stopped. Saren spoke softly. Truth is not a plan. That does not mean we should keep lying. No, he said. It means you must know what comes after the truth. Lina left the archive with the tablet hidden beneath her shawl. The courtyard was almost empty. She was thinking about Saran's words, so she did not notice the man standing partly behind a column. He watched her cross the courtyard. Then he looked toward the archive door. Lina walked home without knowing that the secret was no longer only hers and Saran's. The next morning, 2 guards came to the pottery workshop. Governor Marek requests Lina. Nimi stepped into the doorway. For what? They did not tell us. Darren tried to stand. If she does not come back. Lina stopped him. If I am not home by sunset, go to Saran. She spoke quietly so the guards would not hear. Then she followed them into the center of Aram. Before leaving, Lina found one private moment at the rear of the workshop. She lifted the same loose floor stone and placed the wrapped tablet beneath it. Then she covered the space again. If Marek wanted the tablet, he would not get it simply by asking. Lina stood, wiped the dust from her hands, and walked toward the waiting guards. Marek's hall did not look like a palace. There was no throne. There were tables covered with clay records, water plans, grain lists, and messages from different districts. Marek stood beside one of them. He was older than Lina expected. Sit, he said. I would rather stand. A small expression passed across his face. Then stand. He sent the guards outside. You found something inside the old temple wall, Marek said. Lina said nothing. He opened a wooden box on the table. Inside were old tablets. Lina recognized the fire-darkened edges. Her anger changed direction. You already know. Yes. How many people know? Some senior scribes, some high house leaders, some governors before me. Lina stared at him. So the secret is not a secret to the people who rule. Marek walked to the large window. Look. Below them, the market was open. Grain carts were arriving. Children were running between stalls. When I was a boy, he said, my father told me about the last years of the fighting. There were streets people could not cross. He looked at Lina. This city is not perfect, but food moves, water moves. Children grow up without district wars. And that makes the lie acceptable, Lina asked. It makes the choice difficult. Marek said he feared what would happen if every old rivalry returned at once. Lina thought of Darren's shoulder. She thought of Barak's children. You call this peace, she said. But when workers die, another office is responsible. When water is unfair, another office is responsible. When people serve, the gods are responsible. Marek's face tightened. Lina asked, when did protecting peace become protecting privilege? For the first time, he had no quick answer. When Lina returned home, Darren was sitting outside with a stick in his hand. I need to show you something. He drew a square in the dirt, the reservoir. Then he drew several lines from it. I cannot read every mark on the official plans, he said. But I can see where men are digging. Lina crouched beside him. Show me. Darren drew 3 wide lines toward the north. These go to the high house fields. He drew another. This goes toward temple land. Then he scratched one narrow line toward the south. And this is ours. Lina stared at it. The south sent workers too. Every district did. The south paid too. Darren nodded. But most of the water goes north. The problem was no longer only an old story. It was in the ground beneath them. At the reservoir, the difference was clear. The northern channels were wide. The southern line was smaller. Workers from poor districts carried baskets under the same hard sun as everyone else. Barak had died helping build it. Lina finally understood what Saran had meant when he said peace had changed into privilege. But another thought followed. Silence is not a plan either. By evening, People in the market were whispering about the hidden tablet. Some said it proved the high houses had no right to rule. Others said the temple had hidden the real history of Aram. One man claimed the tablet said all land belonged to the workers. Lena knew that was false. The secret had begun to move without her. A hidden tablet could be controlled. A rumor could not. The next morning, workers from several districts started walking toward the central square. Some carried tools because they had come directly from work. Darren watched them pass. "Do not just make them angry," he told Lena. "What should I do?" He looked at the road. "Make them listen." Lena saw the crowd growing in the distance. "Then I have to make sure they hear the whole story." Before leaving, Lena told Nemi everything. She showed her the tablet. "The old record does not say the gods chose one family to rule," Lena said. "It does not say families like ours were born to serve." Nemi sat down slowly. "All these years, I know. I told you to accept your place. You told us what you were taught." Nemi looked at the tablet, as if it had changed the shape of the room. Nemi stood and took Lena's hands. "If you go, can you promise me you will come home?" Lena wanted to say yes. She could not. "I will try." Nemi's eyes filled with fear, but she did not ask Lena to stay again. "Come back." Darren stepped forward. "I am going too." "No," Lena and Nemi said together. Darren frowned. "Then do not let them turn it into another lie." The central square was already full when Lena arrived. Workers stood across the open ground. Guards formed a line below the meeting hall steps. Marak waited above them. Saran stood near the guards, looking older than he had the night before. People began turning as Lena entered. Some knew her. Others only knew she was the girl with the tablet. The crowd opened enough for her to move forward. A tall worker stepped into her path. His name was Karel. "Give me the tablet." "No. We have people who can read it." "That is not the same as understanding it." Karl pointed toward the high houses. "We understand enough. They told us the gods gave them power. Your tablet proves they lied." Lina held it closer. "It proves more than that. Then let us use it." That word worried her. Use. Karel lowered his voice. "People have waited long enough." "I know. Then why protect them?" "I am not protecting them. You are holding the thing that can end their power." Lena looked at the workers around him. "You want the part that helps you. I want freedom." "And the rest of the story?" Karel's jaw tightened. "We can talk about the rest after." Lena shook her head. "That is how another lie begins." Marek's voice came from the steps. "Bring the tablet to me." The guards moved. Workers pushed forward. Someone lifted a hammer. Another person threw a piece of clay that broke near a guard's feet. Lena felt bodies closing around her. For one frightening moment, the square looked like the story Saran had told about the old war. Then an elderly man stepped into the empty space between the two sides. Saran raised one hand. "Stop." A guard stared at him. Saran, "Move." The old scribe did not move. The workers also paused. Lena saw that he was afraid. His hands were shaking. Still, he stayed between the crowd and the guards. "Perhaps today," he said, "is exactly when I should stop being a coward." Saran turned to face the workers. "My name is Saran. I served this temple for most of my life." People shouted questions. He waited. Then he said, "I helped write the story you were taught." The square became quiet. "I helped write that the gods gave some families the right to lead. I helped write that other families were born to serve." Someone shouted, "Liar!" Saran nodded. "Yes." Marak stepped forward. "This is not the place." Saran looked at him. "It is the only place left." Then he turned toward Lena. "They should not listen only to me. Let her read." Lena climbed the first steps. The tablet felt heavier than before. Marek spoke quietly as she passed. "You cannot control what happens after this." Lena looked at him. "You knew the truth and decided no one else could be trusted with it." Lena faced the crowd. Her hands were shaking, so she held the tablet with both of them. "This record tells an older story of Aram." She read slowly. 7 families came after a flood. One knew grain, one knew building. Others knew pottery, healing, trade, records, and water. They survived because they worked together, Lena said. No family in this record is chosen by the gods to rule the others. For a second, no one moved. Then the square exploded with voices. No chosen rulers, they lied to us. Carell turned toward the crowd. You hear that? Guards tightened their line. High house officials stepped backward. Lena looked at the anger spreading through the square. She understood why Saran had been afraid. Truth had entered the crowd. But truth and anger were not the same thing. Carell raised his voice. They stole our lives. No, Lena shouted. The crowd quieted enough to hear her. Carell stared at her. What do you mean, no? There is more. We already know enough. There is more. We already know enough. That is what you said before. Lena lifted her free hand. If I hide the part you do not like, how am I different from the people who hid this tablet? Carell said nothing. So Lena continued. She read about the drought. She read about closed canals, burned grain stores, divided guards, and years of fighting. Then she told them why the news story had been created. Some workers looked confused. Are you defending them? Someone called. No. Lena looked toward Barak's widow and children in the crowd. Something can begin for one reason and later become something else. A lie that helped stop a war had later been used to excuse unfair power. Lena turned toward Mark. The reservoir. His face changed. Workers from every district are building it. Barak died there. Is it false that the largest channels go toward the high house fields? Marak looked over the crowd. No. The word moved through the square like another shock. A high house official whispered to him. Marak ignored the man. No, he repeated. That part is true. Carell shouted, then remove them all. Some workers cheered. Lena turned to him. And tomorrow, who controls the grain? Who opens the gates? Who repairs the canals? You sound like Saran. He was right about one thing. Truth is not a plan. Marek looked down at her. Then what do you want? Show the water plans publicly. Give every district representatives. Let workers stop dangerous work. Open the old records. The square became quieter. Marak stood in silence. Then he said, reservoir work will stop for 3 days. Several officials turned toward him. The plans will be displayed. Each district will choose 2 people to review them. Lena shook her head. That is not enough. No, Marak said, but it is more than yesterday. The guards lowered their staffs. Workers lowered their tools. No one cheered. People simply began talking instead of pushing. 3 days later, representatives from across Aram sat at the same table as water officials. The southern district chose an older builder named Tarek. They also chose Barak's widow. High house representatives came too. For the first time, the reservoir plan was placed in front of people who had carried the mud, dug the trenches, and lost friends building it. The meeting was not peaceful, but the arguments were public. Barak's widow stood during the meeting. She placed the small green bag on the table. Everyone recognized it. This is what the city gave my children after their father died. No one spoke. I do not want another bag. She looked at the water officials. I want the next worker to come home alive. Marak lowered his eyes. The bag stayed in the center of the table for the rest of the meeting. The plan changed. The northern fields still received water because much of Aram's grain grew there, but the southern and western channels were widened. A new safety rule was also written. If workers saw serious cracks or unstable ground, they could stop until the site was checked. When Darren heard about it, he smiled. So officials finally believe workers can see walls. Lena laughed. Do not become proud. I am injured. Pride is all I have. Saran also faced a council. He stood before senior scribes and admitted what he had done. I believed fear was a good reason to control what people knew, he said. I no longer believe that. He lost his position as head scribe. The archives would no longer be controlled by one person. Saran accepted the decision. When Lena asked how he felt, he said, Older, mostly. You are already old. That is very disrespectful, she smiled. The temple slowly opened more records. Some scribes complained that ordinary people might misunderstand them. Then teach them, Saren answered. Lena began studying reading again. One morning she pressed several signs into wet clay. Saren looked at them. Is that grain? It is supposed to be goat. Your goat looks hungry. Perhaps goats should learn to read. Saren sighed. You were easier when you only broke water cups. Darren's shoulder healed. When he returned to the pottery wheel, his first jar leaned badly to one side. Lena stared at it. You have somehow become worse. It is a new style. Nemi walked over. If that is a new style, take it outside. Darren held the crooked jar proudly. The workshop filled with laughter again. This time, Lena noticed how much she had missed that sound. Months later, Lena stood inside the small classroom near the temple. The same boy who had once asked the first question sat among the children. There were now children from pottery families, farming families, builders, and market workers. Several clay tablets rested on the table. Lina looked toward the open doorway. Saran was there, listening. Then the boy raised his hand. Which story is the true one? Lena looked at the two tablets before her. One was the older record of 7 families building Aram together. The other carried the later official story. She placed them side by side. The old tablet tells us something the later story hid, she said. But an old tablet is still written by people. The children leaned closer. So how do we know? Another child asked. We read, we compare, we ask questions. The first boy raised his hand again. Can scribes lie? Lena looked toward the doorway. Saran lifted one eyebrow. Yes, Lena said. The children laughed. Saran placed a hand over his heart. I came here to support education, not to be attacked by it. Even Lena laughed. Then the room became quiet again as she turned back to the tablets. A story can tell us where people came from, Lena said, but it should never decide what you are allowed to become. She pushed both tablets toward the children. No one pointed to one of them and said, because it is written. The children moved closer and began looking at the marks for themselves. Lena smiled. Let us read them together.